wanted it, Joe Biden wanted it. But when you do look at the 4 years that he did have, to Tim's point, there is it's a complicated picture. And I think some people look back on it and say, and the discrete things that he wanted to do and that he tried to do, it wasn't as bad as I think the political view of it is. And Scott, I know that you're getting ready to disagree with me, but there is a political view of history, and then there is a view of history that takes it into context.
Well, let me preface my take by offering condolences to the Carter family and on his death. He was obviously one of the most unique post-presidencies we've ever had because he lived so long and he did so much. That having been said, he was a terrible president. That's why he lost in a landslide after his one term. And if it's possible, I think he was even a worse ex-president because of his meddling in U.S. foreign policy, because of his saddling up to dictators around the world, because of his vehement views, anti-Israel views, and more than dabbling in anti-Semitism over the years. He often vexed Democrats. Obama didn't even have him speak at his 2008 convention. He put Bill Clinton in a terrible foreign policy box on a North Korea nuclear issue. I think he was a guy who had a huge ego and believed that he was uniquely positioned to do all these things, even after the American people had roundly and soundly rejected his leadership. So I respect people who run for president and get elected president, but in his particular case, I think he time and again proved why he was never suited for the office in the first place.
Before you jump into him, I just want to show this. This is what the economic picture was when Carter was president. How much of it is this? Just the fact, simply, that the consumer price index was all the way up to the top of the screen, practically. And the only other time it really made that kind of jump was during the pandemic. And similarly to Biden, the economy is often what drives these decisions by voters.
I don't often say this, but Scott, I agree with you to a certain extent. President Carter was meddlesome with his successors. He forgot sometimes that he still wasn't president. But that alone shouldn't mar the record of global humanitarian good that he did. Let me tell you a story. I only had the privilege of meeting President Carter once, and it was because I was with a group of presidential library directors, and he had changed his mind. He had decided, he had been pushed a little bit, to revitalize the museum, and he and Rosalind Carter gave us a personalized tour of the museum. And he talked about his political career, and he talked about his presidency, and he showed some satisfaction. But when he lit up was when he was talking about guinea worm and talking about what the Carter Center had done, and wanted to be sure that the folks in the global south or the developing world would be without this scourge. And and he was 86 at the time. And I saw that what animated this man was pure humanitarianism. For all the meddlesome behavior as a post-president, which is well documented, I don't think that it outweighs the contribution that he made as a global citizen after he left.
So can I just offer one retort, which is this. In the run-up to the Persian Gulf War, he wrote letters
I know about this,
to all of our allies and to Arab states, asking them to abandon their cooperation and coalition with the United States of America. If it's not treasonous, it's borderline treasonous. And so I hear what you're saying about the humanitarianism, but when you're an ex-president and you have served in that office, I think you have a duty to the United States and only to the United States. And when he did that and other instances, to me, it showed that he cared more about his own legacy than he did about the country, and I think that is wrong.
But I respect that, but I just want to remind you.
He was a decent man. I think that's what it really comes down to. He stood on principle. Whether you agree with it or not, whether the president agreed with it or not, whether the party agreed with it or not, he stood on principle, and that's how he lived his life. He represented a political swing of the pendulum from the most corrupt administration we'd ever seen in Nixon to somebody who actually believed that he wanted to help people.
And
that's what Jimmy Carter was about.
That may have been
if you ask any American
downfall.
what they think about Jimmy Carter's post-presidency, any random American, they're going to tell you they like him because they saw his great work with Habitat for Humanity. And, you know, if an image tells a story, we all saw the image repeatedly of he and Rosalind doing that very good work. It doesn't change the fact of how he cozied up with dictators in the global south and certainly in the Middle East. That is very troublesome. And, you know, but I'm also reminded one thing is, you know, you showed the graph earlier and the ad that Jimmy Carter ran. Jimmy Carter's a really smart guy. And when he ran in 1976, he said, the fact that inflation is at 6.5% isn't what matters. That's just a number. This is about people paying their mortgage and making their lives work on a day-to-day basis.